Thank you very much for this generous introduction. And again, first of all, I would like to thank Dr. Niels and his colleagues for inviting me to be part of this interesting and timely conference. So the title of my presentation is The Significance of Real Ecological Change. What I'm going to do is first, I will introduce my topic, and then I will talk about the significance of real ecological change. And under this, I will look at ecological change and climate change in Africa and biodiversity loss in Africa. And the last one, the way forward. So the purpose of my presentation is to explore the concept of real ecological change and its impact on the relations between living beings and the environment and different cultural, geographical, and climatic contexts. So I use the term ecological change just to refer to change in ecosystems, species interactions, and environmental conditions over time. And again, I use the phrase real ecological change to refer to actual shifts observed in natural systems due to human impact, climate change, and other factors. Ecological change affects all of us, and it's important to study the cause and the effects of ecological change to address this problem. The significance of real ecological change. Organisms are interconnected within cultural, geographical, and climatic environments. So different factors affected the relationship between different organisms. And in particular, cultural practices and beliefs, and at the same time, geographical factors also influenced the relationship between different living entities. For example, unlike Western philosophy, some of my colleagues already stated, African environmental philosophy developed a holistic view of the world. Human beings are part and parcel of the natural environment. There is no dichotomy between human beings and the natural environment. So that is one important point. Ecological change has a significant impact on the survival of species, the functioning, resilience, and stability of ecosystems, the nature of ecosystem services, and the ecological balance of Mother Earth. Ecological change can have two influences. On the one hand, it can create opportunities to study the relationship between different entities. It has also created some challenges we are required to deal with. So real ecological change is driven by land use and land cover change, pollution, overexploitation of natural resources, invasive species, climate change, and more. Ecological change and climate change in Africa. Climate change is one of the most pressing problems facing humanity today. It's a very serious issue. There are some fossil fuel companies and some scientists who rejected the reality of climate change. But climate change is real. We are facing the negative consequences of climate change. And the burden of climate change is disproportionately borne by vulnerable regions, including Africa. Let me briefly state about emissions disparities. Developed countries, the so-called global norths, have contributed a lot to climate change. But developing countries, including Africa, are the major victims of climate change. For example, since 1751, the United States has emitted nearly 400 billion tons of carbon dioxide, and about 71% of global industrial emissions are currently caused by 100 fossil fuel companies in the world. And again, 20 private companies are responsible for the third of all energy-related carbon dioxide and methane emissions. In particular, state-owned companies in different parts of the world, including some developing countries, are responsible for the emission of carbon dioxide and other gases. Developing countries, global south, suffer the consequences. Just to mention one example, 91% of climate and weather-related diseases over the past 50 years have occurred in developing countries, including in Africa. Let me briefly talk about the impact of climate change on Africa. When you look at the impact of climate change on Africa, we don't have comprehensive study of the consequences and the causes of climate change in Africa. And there are very few climate scientists in Africa. And some countries do not have adequate and functioning weather stations and a nationally representative survey. As a matter of fact, usually reports about climate change are based on external evidence rather than internal evidence. So I can give you one example. The last or the sixth assessment report on Africa, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. When you read that chapter had about 35 or 37 authors. And most of the authors are either from South Africa or other scientists who are based in South Africa. Some regions are not represented in this. And these authors did not pay any attention to climate ethics. They didn't mention one article. They didn't mention several articles published in the African continent. So the basis of their work is articles based in the so-called reputable journals in the North. So what is required is fact-based reports on climate change. We need to study climate change, the causes of climate change, and the consequences of climate change very seriously by traveling to different parts of the continent. So there was no robust studies on climate change in North Africa and in North and at the same time Central Africa. Again, terrestrial ecosystems are the focus of most climate studies in Africa. And African researchers have limited data collection, data access and research funding, hampering research into marine ecosystems, agriculture, migration, and health and well-being. So what are the major causes of climate change in Africa? This is very important. There are two major causes of climate change: natural causes, that refers to ocean cycles, and El Nino events. I will show the impacts of this. In particular, El Nino Southern Oscillation, Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, and Indian Ocean dipole can influence weather patterns and climate variability in Africa. These natural causes had negative impact on some countries in 2019 and at the same time in 2024. I will show this later. Human-driven causes. First and foremost, when you compare natural causes and human-driven causes, human activity has a greater impact on climate change than natural causes, according to Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So that is very serious. So this includes greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels, land use change, agricultural practices, and so forth. So both have had negative impact on the African continent. So the African continent is the least responsible for increasing atmospheric carbon concentrations, are suffered a lot. And according to one writer a long time ago, about 24 years ago, he said, this is the great global injustice. So after that, a number of scholars have also considered how this has been one form of global climate injustice. So climate change is fundamentally an ethical issue. And at the same time, it's a question of justice, precisely because developed countries contributed a lot to climate change, but Africans and other developing countries are paying a lot of price. It makes this problem, therefore, an ethical problem. So Africa currently has the lowest per capita greenhouse gas emissions of all regions. Africa only emits 2 to 3% of the world's energy and industrial carbon dioxide, with 0.8 metric tons of a carbon footprint per person, compared to the global average of 3.9 tons. So the gap between the two is very, very serious. So Africa is also vulnerable to climate change effects because of various reasons, because of its weak adaptive capacity, limited diffusion of relevant technologies, high dependence on climate-sensitive sectors such as agriculture, and so on and so forth. Now, pay attention to the last one. 55 to 62% of jobs in sub-Saharan Africa are in agriculture, and 95% of farmlands is rain-fed. If there is no rain one season, a number of countries will suffer a lot. So climate change is contributing to various problems, including disproportionate vulnerability, extensive floods, tropical cyclones, increased drought frequency, food insecurity, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to give you some examples, case studies of specific regions or countries within Africa experiencing significant impacts. One example is the Horn of Africa. Now, these last 3 years, about 50 million people in the Horn of Africa and 100 million people in the wide region were directly affected by drought. More than 66 million people faced hunger and starvation in parts of Ethiopia, Somalia, and Kenya. And again, severe droughts has led to crop failures, reduced yields, increased food insecurity, reduced productivity of livestock, and so forth. About 9.5 million livestock died because of drought. And again, in February 2024, about 4.4 million people were internally displaced in Ethiopia, partly because of climate change and other factors. So drought affects almost all parts of Africa, Ethiopia. For example, to give you one example, Ethiopia's southern Borno region, which is very close to Kenya, had almost no rainfall for the last 3 years. And the ongoing drought from 2021 to early 2023 resulted in the deaths of approximately 3.3 million head of livestock. They died because of drought. And the displacement of approximately 300,000 people in a small region. Additionally, some other animals also died because of climate change. So this is the map of Ethiopia. Therefore, in the north, in the west, at the same time in the south, different regions were affected by this drought. So this extreme drought in Oromia Borno zone, which is very close to Kenya. So this is the effect of climate change. And again, you can also see the effect of climate change, how different animals died because of drought. And again, this is another example in 2023. And again, these also indicate the effects of the drought on the remaining livestock. Probably most of these animals died because of climate change. This was in 2022. And again, flooding in East Africa recently. Flooding in Tanzania, Kenya, and Burundi killed hundreds of people. For example, in Tanzania, 155 people died because of drought. And again, 210 people died between March and May this year. And from March to April 2024, floods in Kenya displaced 66,000 people, killed 4,000 livestock, and destroyed 27 acres of crops and damaged 22 roads in Kenya. Sadly, some years back, this region suffered from drought. Now it is suffering from flooding. This is ridiculous. So what is the cause of the current floods? The current severe flooding in East Africa is linked to the Indian Ocean dipole, a periodic temperature fluctuation in the Indian Ocean. In recent months, a positive phase of the Indian Ocean dipole has coincided with El Nino as it happened in 2016. So that has led to flooding in different parts of this region. So for example, these public minibuses are caught in the flooded streets of Dar es Salaam in April 2024. And again, residents gather at the riverbed to search for missing people in Kenya. That is one example. And again, this is in Burundi. So different parts of this region are suffering from flooding. So coastal erosion is also serious in different parts of the continent, in eastern part, and at the same time in western part of the continent. Economic and social consequences. Climate change has led to loss of livelihoods. Small-scale farmers Fisherfolk and rural communities face crop failures and displacement. And climate change also led to internal migration and at the same time migration to other countries. It has also led to health challenge. It became the cause of different diseases, including malaria, dengue fever, cholera, valley fever, and so forth. What will happen in the next few years? According to some studies, these increased droughts and floods will continue. So according to, for example, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released in 2022, quote, most African countries will enter unprecedented high temperature climate earlier in this century than generally weather higher latitude countries, emphasizing the urgency of adaptation measures in Africa, end of quote. So this impact will continue in the coming years. International dimensions of climate change. Climate change has no boundaries. Even developed countries have been suffering from climate change. I can give you just one example. During climate wave, European heat wave, a number of people died in Europe. For example, quote, among those nearly 4,000 deaths in Spain, more than 1,000 in Portugal, more than 3,200 in the United Kingdom, and around 4,500 people died in Germany. So we can say that climate change has had negative impacts even on developed countries. And again, 2023 was the hottest year ever in the history of this climate change events. For example, in the summer of 2023, 18.4 million hectares of land in Canada were burned by fire. This is very serious. So when you look at how humanity has attempted to deal with this issue, it seems that the international community is not really serious because it has been very difficult to build consensus among UN member states because different states promote their own vested interests at the expense of the well-being of human beings and at the same time non-human beings. So the international system is inadequate. And although there are some good international environmental agreements, it has been very difficult to, at the same time, enforce these laws. Notably, in 2009, developed nations promised to give about $100 billion by 2020 to developing countries, but very few countries fulfill their promises. So they fail to deliver on their promises. And various countries also fail to reduce climate change to 1.5 degrees Celsius targets. Many countries failed to do so. And again, the Conference of Parties in 2023 held in Dubai also made some good change. So they launched a loss and damage fund. They pledged to triple renewable energy capacity by 2030. However, the COP 2080 communique is non-binding, and justice was not given enough attention. So the most important point is delivery. So different nations are not ready to fulfill their promises. And then let me proceed to biodiversity loss in Africa. What is biodiversity? Biodiversity has been defined in various ways. First, it was defined by the Convention on Biological Diversity. But in this presentation, I use the concept to refer to the wealth of genes, species, ecosystems, and ecological processes that make our living planet what it is: genetic diversity, species diversity, ecosystems diversity, and so on. Biodiversity in Africa. When you look at the African continent is a continent rich in biodiversity. About a quarter of global biodiversity is found in the African continent. In particular, when you look at key biodiversity hotspots, from 34 biodiversity hotspots in the world, 8 are found in Africa. I've mentioned this because of time constraint. I'm not going to mention them. So Africa is home to all species on Earth. According to one writer, African biodiversity supported about 16% of the global population. So I mentioned some countries: South Africa, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Tanzania, Madagascar, Cameroon, Gabon, Ethiopia, Kenya, Mozambique, Angola, and Uganda are the countries with the highest plant diversity on the continent. So African peasant farmers and pastoralists have positive relationship with biodiversity. As I said earlier, therefore, they have promoted a holistic view of the world, and they consider themselves as part and parcel of the natural environment. Therefore, they recreated different crops and species. State of knowledge of biodiversity in Africa. And again, we see similar problems, as I've already indicated, in relation to climate change. So according to one writer, Siding, he stated that we have biodiversity data deficiency because of some reasons: conflicts between different groups in the African continent, political stability, absence of regular and policy-driven monitoring programs, weak facilities, and irregular or insufficient funding. And again, most of the time, the focus is on charismatic mega fauna, big animals, at the expense of other animals. What are the major threats to biodiversity in Africa? Until recently, there has been no systematic and comprehensive assessment of the most pervasive threats to biodiversity in sub-Saharan Africa, according to some scholars. So they said they are the first to do so. So there was no prioritization of the money direct threats to biodiversity in sub-Saharan Africa. So the question is, what are the main drivers of the decline and loss of biodiversity in sub-Saharan Africa? There are both direct and indirect threats to biodiversity. What are direct threats to biodiversity in Africa? They include illegal hunting and agricultural expansion. Indirect threats to biodiversity: the growth of human population and overconsumption of resources. As I said earlier, these writers, I found their article very, very serious and very important. So they relied on 3 different studies, and finally they found out that, first, annual and perennial crops and fishing and harvesting aquatic resources in marine and freshwater areas, logging and wood harvesting in natural forests, and hunting and collecting terrestrial animals are the major threats to biodiversity in Africa. In Central Africa, the major threat to biodiversity is hunting. In Western Africa, Southern Africa, and at the same time, Eastern Africa, the major threat is agriculture. We can also mention other factors. For example, I consider climate change as one of the most important contributors to biodiversity loss in Africa. And the loss of habitats, agrochemical nutrients, and pollution, the introduction of invasive species, mining activities, poverty itself contributed to biodiversity loss. Sometimes when peasant farmers are very, very poor, although they note that their activity will contribute to biodiversity, they overexploit the resources because they have no other options. Contamination by pollutants, the spread of diseases, resettlements, flooding of vast areas of forest, and so forth have also contributed to biodiversity loss in Africa. So there are also some invasive species, including, for example, in Tana Lake in Ethiopia and in other areas. So these species have contributed to biodiversity loss. Illegal hunting and species decline. Just to give you one example, the number of elephants on the African savanna has fallen from nearly 20 million before colonization to just 352, 271 in 2016. It's unbelievable. With 30% of that decline occurred in the first decade of the 21st century, in 10 years. So emerging diseases have had negative impacts on biodiversity in Africa. For example, Ebola virus killed not only human beings, but also animals. Even COVID-19 probably affected some animals. We don't know. We have to study the impact of this. Cultural diversity and biodiversity. Language extinction can also lead to the disappearance of cultural and biological diversity. UNESCO estimated that 2,500 languages are in danger of becoming extinct. There are about 2,000 languages in the African continent. African language, there are about 308 which are endangered languages. Already 201 African languages disappeared. The way forward, what should be done to help solve these problems? First, we need sustainable resource use and management. Different people in the African continent and in other regions of the world are required to promote sustainable practices in agriculture, forestry, fisheries, and energy production. That is the first. And the second one, climate action. Different countries should try to mitigate climate change by promoting environment-friendly energy sources, including solar, wind, hydro, and geothermal resources. And therefore, they have to reduce fossil fuel use and promote energy efficiency. They should also try to adapt to climate change by using different methods. There are some indigenous climate mitigation and at the same time adaptation strategies. Therefore, modern societies can also learn from indigenous people, and at the same time, indigenous people can also learn from modern societies and scientists. So together, they can make a difference by adapting to this climate change. So, to address the climate change crisis and climate injustice in Africa, African governments should protect human rights, because climate change is also partly a human rights issue. And again, strengthen healthcare systems, transition to renewable energy, implement climate resilient strategies, address gender disparities. It is one form of climate injustice. Women are suffering a lot because of climate change, because of their position in different countries. And they have to implement climate resilient agriculture, developing drought-resistant crops, agroforestry, growing crops and trees together, precision irrigation, adapt climate-smart agricultural practices, promote sustainable water management, and at the same time, enhance climate information services. That is very, very important. If you don't know what is going on in the African continent, and if you simply rely on external sources, you are not in a position to address this problem. So climate information is very important. And at the same time, they have to adapt a people-centered approach to climate action. They support localized solutions, including indigenous knowledge and community-based resilience, increase the adaptive capacity, community involvement. Usually, peasant farmers and other indigenous people are not part and parcel of climate change and at the same time, development planning, and at the same time, the implementation of climate change action and development planning. Therefore, we need to engage local communities in conservation efforts. As I said earlier, we need to recognize the contribution of indigenous knowledge to environmental protection. As our colleagues from Nigeria stated, we can learn a lot from African peasant farmers. And again, there are also some indigenous and community-owned conservation areas. We should also promote that. Another important point is we have to empower the youth. That is central. We have to educate and inspire the next generation to become environmental stewards. And again, as I said, we have to try to integrate climate science and at the same time, indigenous science. Education and advocacy, that is very important. Environmental literacy, we have to raise awareness about ecological change. Behavioral change is very important. We have to encourage eco-friendly behaviors such as reducing waste, recycling, and supporting sustainable products. And as I said, not only communities, we should also engage policy makers. We have to disobey climate inaction. I can give you some examples even in the West, in Europe, and in Australia. One example from Australia, Rising Tide Australia, is a regionally specific climate justice movement established in 2004. It influenced policy makers in Australia. And again, another example, the Extinction Rebellion, a radical grassroots movement established in 2018 in the United Kingdom. So it has three basic aims. First, it requires the government to tell the truth. That is the first requirement. And the second one is they have to cut down carbon emissions. And the third one, convene citizens' assemblies to develop new policies for social and environmental well-being. That is one example, and it's very, very important. And so, therefore, we have to encourage our brothers and sisters in developed countries to influence their policymakers. And one day, probably in the near future, policymakers and the leaders will listen to the people and try to address climate change and other environmental problems. And again, the youth-led climate strikes associated with Greta Thunberg that began in August 2018 can have a positive impact on policymakers and the public. Therefore, we have to try to use the youth because the future belongs to them. Corporate responsibilities, and we have to make corporations accountable to their actions. They have to use sustainable business practices. Another important point, individual action. Individual actions can make a difference. Each of you, all of us, have our own contribution. Therefore, to help address the lack of biodiversity data according to CIDINC, committed and supportive national governments, a network of long-term and continent-wide endangered species and biodiversity monitoring initiatives, and citizen science biodiversity monitoring programs should be implemented. Therefore, the people can also contribute to climate science. Again, the importance of international cooperation and solidarity. Ecological change happens at different levels. It happens locally, nationally, and at the same time, internationally. So climate change affects all regions, although developing countries are the major victims of climate change. Developed countries are also paying the price. Therefore, we have to be very serious. And it is clear that because of climate change, some indigenous climate mitigation and adaptation strategies are no longer effective. They are less effective. Therefore, existing paradigms and theories are being challenged by climate change. Recently, climate scientists have started to reconsider the relationship between different organisms that come after climate change. In this connection, let me give you one example about novelty and ecological restoration. As you know, novelty refers to something new that starts currently. So it refers to, quote, the emergence of ecological novelty from diverse drivers of change. As human activities continue to alter the Earth's ecosystems irreparably, restorationists encounter new challenges because some changes have no historical precedent. And the first major happening or challenge is the emergence of novel environmental states that have never ever happened in the past. That is the first. And the second, growing restoration toolkit. Restorationists have access to an ever-expanding toolkit of technologies and interventions, new technologies, including artificial intelligence, to deal with these effects of climate change. So, some novel ecological states have little or no historical precedent. So, anthropogenic climate change has also led to invasive species. Invasive species challenge historical continuity. In some places, some invasive species have led to the destruction of indigenous species. So that is very serious. So it's very difficult to deal with these issues. So climate change can make, according to one American colleague of mine, environmental ethicist, Sandler, he said that it can make place-based preservation or reserve-oriented protections useless. It didn't say that it is totally useless, but climate change makes it less efficient, less effective. So bionovelty can have societal and cultural implications. So climate change disrupts historical narratives of justification for culturally driven restorations. So what should be done? Given the high rate and magnitude of ecological climate change, historical baselines are not appropriate restoration targets. So we need to look toward the future, not the past, for what will be ecologically suitable and value preserving. It doesn't mean that we have to forget the past. No, but we have to try to anticipate what will happen and try to prepare ourselves and deal with this problem. Of course, what historical baseline conditions to follow and even the extent to which history is assisted in restoration will always be influenced by cultural values. So, transboundary issues such as the loss of the ozone layer, the pollution of the oceans, the disposal of nuclear waste, the inequitable relationship between the global north and the global south, pandemics, including COVID-19 and other pandemics that will come in the near future, deforestation, pollution, climate change, and so on and so forth, require international cooperation, precisely because a single country cannot address this problem alone. Finally, I argue that collective action, cooperation, and knowledge sharing among countries are needed to address imminent threats such as climate change, biodiversity loss, and environmental degradation, as no single actor can solve these problems alone. Neighborhood environmental awareness around our place alone does not enable us to solve global environmental problems, although it is important. Again, the benefits and burdens of ecological change should be distributed fairly, and major contributors to climate change should help countries affected by climate change because they are responsible for this climate change. As a matter of fact, therefore, they have to promote climate justice and at the same time global justice. Africa and other developing countries should be supported in their move towards using environmental DNA technology to monitor their biodiversity. Another important part which I would like to emphasize is we have to support research and monitoring to understand ecosystem dynamics, species interactions, and ecological change and its impacts. As I said earlier on, most of the members of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change are friends, okay? If I have a friend, I will invite him and he will join the committee that is working on Africa and so forth. But instead of doing that, we have to recruit serious scientists who are familiar with climate change in Africa and try to study the major causes of climate change and at the same time the consequences of climate change. So we have to support research and at the same time monitor this. Finally, call to action. Urgent action is essential to mitigate climate change's impact and preserve Earth's rich biodiversity. Our actions today shape the planet's future. We must work together to ensure a fair and sustainable future. Let us advocate for climate justice and resilience, and I would like to invite all of you to make your own fair contribution to the solution to climate change and other environmental problems. Thank you very much for your attention.